Welcome to the Alain Guillot podcast, a podcast about life, leadership, and money matters. Our guest today is Alex Renton. Alex is a British Canadian journalist and author. He has written for British newspapers such as The Independent, the London Evening Standard, and The Times, and he is the author of three books: Planet Carnivore, Stiff Upper Lip, and today we will speak about his latest book, Blood Legacy, Reckoning with a Family's Story of Slavery. Alex, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Anna, for having me along.
So I'm surprised, well, not completely surprised, but I was amused to find out that you are a fellow Canadian, although you didn't spend much time here. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about your background. First of all, how did you ended up being a Canadian or born in Canada, and then your journey into journalism?
Yeah, well, I think my dad migrated in about 1959 from, he's Scottish British, and then my mum he married my mum, who's Scottish, and she went out to join him, and then they kind of decided to come back again. I'm not totally sure why. I mean, he was working, in the banking industry when he was out, and so I was born in Huron Street in Toronto, or at least that's where we lived, and. But, I have no memory of it. I came back when I was 2, but I'm very proud holder of a Canadian passport. Prouder than I am of my British passport.
Okay, so then you had an expensive education in Britain, and you learned all kind of things except the subject of our book, which is slavery. Can you tell us about your journey into education and then journalism?
Yeah, so I mean, my parents are sort of, quite wealthy middle class people, and my father went to Eton and to a boarding school at 8 years old, and and I and my siblings had to do the same because that's the tradition, and that's what turns us into great rulers of the empire. But even when there isn't an empire to rule, it was a good education. I mean, I can't say I was very happy as a boarder, but I think it left me a bit of a rebel, like sort of questioning authority, and that's a good background for being a journalist. And that after university, that I kind of went into there via a bit of time in the theatre and in the arts, and then I was a war correspondent for a while for the Evening Standard, and then I worked for Oxfam in East Asia. So I tried to be one of those liberal do-gooders, putting the world to right. I've managed to fail at that, and we didn't put the world to right. I mean, but it's a nice job. I mean, I traveled all over the place, and then I got into writing about history, and particularly my family's history, because we helped run this empire. We were part of the elite of it, and a lot of what I saw as an adult, as a reporter, told me the empire hadn't been such a good thing after all, and despite what I'd been taught at school.
Okay, and can you? I'm intrigued by the books that you have written. Can you just give us like one or two liners about each one of them?
Well, Planet Carnival was an early book about the challenge of meat eating on the planet. Because I used to do quite a lot of food and policy journalism, but then sort of more personal was, as I said, I went to boarding school at 8 years old, and I was pretty unhappy there, and I as life has gone on, I realized more and more people were. I mean, and an awful lot of people who went to these kind of schools were physically and psychologically abused too, and that happened to me. So I decided that this is one of this schooling of the ruling class is one of the great sort of cover-ups of our time. That that there's appalling things happen in these schools, just as in schools for Native Canadians and so on, and in boarding schools in Canada for the upper class too. But I know some of those stories, and that this needed to be told because my class, the elite, had kind of covered up the fact that it had colluded in the abuse of its own children, because they strongly believed that it was a good thing that a child was miserable for a while in order to go out and rule the world. So I wrote that book, which is sort of challenging to my class and my culture. And while I was researching that book, I was in my mother's family to have history in Scotland, have history going back 500 years. And I was in that archive looking at my great-great-great-grandfather's letters home from boarding school. And I kept coming across references to Jamaica and Tobago and businesses in Jamaica and Tobago. And I realized what none of us knew, none of my generation knew, was that we had been deeply involved in plantation ownership and slave ownership and the traffic of enslaved African people from Africa. And we kind of covered it up. I've been brought up to believe my family were the good guys.
Okay.
So needed looking at.
Okay, well, I've been covering slavery and reading slavery books from the perspective of the United States. And according to the United States history, they were colonized, and then the English brought the first ship with a slave, and it was not their fault because the English brought the slave into the American soil. But I wonder, in history, at what time does a European think it's a good idea to go to Africa, kidnap some human beings, and convert them into slaves? When did that happen?
I mean, it starts very early. I mean, really, 100 years after the first colonization of the Americas. I mean, it starts in 1580. I think was the first recorded voyage. And suddenly the British were very keen slavers. I mean, they had taken control of these vast new territories in continental America and in the Caribbean. Spanish were keen slavers as well, and because this was the way to get a cheap workforce and get moving. What I think, I knew more about American slavery like you than I did British, because that was my education. I did an O level in American history. And I think, it wasn't until 5 years ago that I was aware that the British shipped 3.25 million Africans over 250 years, far more than the Americans did after independence, about 100,000, far more than the Spanish, far more than the French. Only the Portuguese shipped more, but because of Brazil. And that, I mean, there are many interesting contrasts with slavery in what was to be the United States, because enslaved people generally had quite a long life in the United States, and they were looked after. I mean, they were looked after like you might look after a horse, but they were looked after. In the Caribbean British colonies, the average life of an enslaved person was 4 years. You used them up, and then you bought another one. It wasn't worth looking after them. And then when the slave trade is abolished, my ancestors deliberately bought more young women so they could breed more slaves, again, like you would horses. So it was a lot more brutal what the British did than what the Americans did, generally, and it was much bigger in scale, and we got much richer. I think the Britain tends to sort of ignore the significance of the Caribbean slave story to today's world, but actually the 19th century industrial revolution is fueled by the money that came out of taxation for slavery and the sugar trade.
In your book, I learned that by the 1770s, it was almost impossible to own slaves in Britain. So that means that you guys had slaves in Britain, I guess, doing domestic work, plantation. What kind of work, or what were they doing, the slave in Britain?
No, I mean, it's really interesting that, because I mean, this is a time of of new modern notions about democracy and the rights of man and individual rights, and it was illegal. You legally could not own another person in Britain by the 1770s, 1780s, rather sooner in Scotland actually. But you could own other human beings offshore, so you could own them in the Caribbean. But it's also clear that my ancestors, my great uncle, who was a member of Parliament and a liberal and so on, who believed in forms of democracy and so on, but not for Black people. It was entirely racist. These things were for white people. Black people were seen as, could only have been, they were Christians, my ancestors, so they could only treat Black people like animals because they thought they were animals.
Right.
And that's really shocking to me. And it's also why this is important today, because the racism that my country suffers from today comes from those beliefs in the 18th and 19th centuries.
Well, it's not that much different from the Declaration of Independence of the United States, where we, all the people, are created
Yes.
equal, except if you are Black, I guess.
Yes, exactly. No, it is the same, but it's interesting that even at that point, already several northern states in 1776 had declared slavery illegal. And Britain, yeah, I was kind of taught that Britain was the first country to abolish slavery. It's not actually true. France abolished slavery during the Revolution at the end of the 18th century. So, I mean, there was more liberal thinking in parts of America, in the northern parts of the United States, than there was anywhere in Britain.
You also point out that there is a gap, a 250-year history gap in English history, where you guys, in spite of the expensive education, you don't get taught about imperialism and slavery. Is this changing, or is this still the rule in England?
I think it's changing slowly. I mean, certainly, my daughter has just turned 17, and she's interested. I've watched her history curriculum. She's certainly taught much more, particularly about the Caribbean, about what Britain did, the enormous looting of India, which is just as significant in making Britain. That's still very little. It's, maybe it's a more complicated story. But I mean, at these expensive, famous schools 40, 50 years ago, was taught so little, it's shocking. And actually, I still find, I mean, when I do book festivals, I sometimes do a little quiz. And I go, right, you're white, educated people, which is what they usually are. You can tell me when the British ended slavery in the British Empire. And really 1 in 10 person, comes within a decade of knowing. But they all know when Americans ended slavery. So, yeah, it's changing. But some of the reaction to this book, which was published in UK in May, has been really savage from white, middle class, older people. Really angry. They accuse me of lying. They accuse me of hating Britain. They accuse me of, betraying the empire and my ancestors. Really mad stuff, but common stuff. Pages of the Times, I've got it.
But at the same time, I mean, like I told you, I'm more familiarized with what's going on in the States. And right now in the States, in many southern states, which were the states that promoted slavery the most, it's become illegal to teach in high school about slavery because it may hurt the feelings of white kids.
Yeah. That's interesting, isn't it? Well, I mean, we're having, it's not quite that extreme in Britain, but we are having those debates. I mean, the Conservative Party here for 10 years have been going, let's put the empire back on the syllabus. And we're going, well, it never was on the syllabus. And what they mean is, let's say, put pride in the empire back on the syllabus, which is very retrogressive. But I mean, yeah, I mean, nothing is as extreme as in the southern United States. I mean, at least we can still teach people the theory of evolution in British schools without them being challenged, and that's true in Canada, I hope, as well. I ought to know that as a Canadian, but I mean, it is interesting, and I mean, in Canada, I mean, one of the things, I'm a Scot. I'm sitting here in Edinburgh. And, we Scots are having to face up to the fact that we were more involved in this slavery industry per head, certainly at the end of it, than anyone else in Europe. I mean,
I was completely surprised by that.
Yeah. No, it's a big story here. And we're looking at the Dundas monument in Edinburgh and Dundas Street in Edinburgh, just as people in Toronto are. But we're denying that as well. People keep saying to me, well, look, we built this beautiful city on slavery money. That shows good things can come from slavery. I go, are you sure that's the way you want to think about it? But,
So how does a business person in Scotland in the 1800s get into the slave trade?
Well, my ancestors, I mean, it's a very good question. I mean, most people in the circle of my ancestors and cousins and so on got in through lending money. And that certainly is how they studied. So there were a lot of private banks, because all this business with the colonies was done always on promissory notes. So in the end, the way modern banking and lending money on a note starts at this period, just because there is no cash crossing the ocean. So generally people bought a bit of land in Jamaica or before that in Virginia or whatever, and borrowed money to develop it at an interest rate, and a whole banking system then sort of starts around that. But what it turns out is that, and then you'd send some poorer white people, but again cousins, people from Scotland, generally clansmen, to go and actually run the estate, buy the slaves, keep the discipline, organize the sugar planting, and that becomes an industry in itself. I mean, 36,000 Scots went to the Caribbean during the 18th century, poor white men, in order to build it up, and quite a few of them ended up in Canada. There's a guy in my book who ends up founding it, who helped manage our plantation, goes to a province in Canada, I can't remember its name, but ends up founding a bank, which becomes the International Bank of Commerce, one of Canada's biggest banks. Sorry, I should have looked up these names. But so part of that poor Scottish-Irish migration to the Americas comes through making a fortune in the Caribbean slavery plantations and then going north to settle in America and Canada. A lot of Scottish slave owners end up in Canada.
So your book cover mostly Tobago and Jamaica, but in reality, all those Caribbean islands were, what is it, plantation, sugar plantation? Or...
Yeah, not tobacco. There's no tobacco there.
Right,
sugar. No, sugar in Jamaica. And we also had a small plantation which failed, where one of my great uncles, you know, I have his letters because he went out to Tobago, the little island of Tobago near Trinidad, and bought land and 70 African people. And there he planted indigo, which is the blue dye, and cotton. No, tobacco is all in the Americas. I don't think there's any tobacco in the Caribbean. It's too hot.
I asked this question to another historian not too long ago, and it made him uncomfortable, but you seem not to have problem with this question. What is the relative value of a slave at this time?
Yeah, so I do. I mean, the book is not history. You know, I try to write it as a popular book. You know, for you know, because I want ordinary people and white people, particularly in Britain, to read this. So I do go into those sort of things. So I estimated a enslaved person, an adult, so there's an inventory done in 1774 when 1777 when my great times 6 uncle died of dysentery in Tobago on the plantation, age 31, of all his belongings, and there it values all the enslaved people, and the most expensive is worth £90 English today, and the children are worth £5 or £10, and you get an idea of what a child is under 6, because over 6 they started working. So you get an idea of that, because a cow was worth £15. So the average adult field worker, enslaved African, was worth about £70. And I estimated that as being, so I can't translate into Canadian dollars, but being about the price of an expensive family car, a Volvo today. Okay. Okay. So a serious amount of money, certainly 2 horses, you know, so real money.
Wow. Okay. So I guess that's the lure for all kind of people to get involved into this trade. I mean,
wait, yeah. I mean, but the thing is, because enslaved people died incredibly fast, as we were saying. I mean, 4 years is the average lifespan. So, and it's kind of weird, given they were so valuable, that they didn't try to look after them better. But the profits from the sugar were much more important, much more interesting, and also the profits in the land, because in the 1750s to 1800 or so, the land price is tripling every 5 or 10 years. So the way to make money was to make a lot of sugar, spend a lot on Africans who were going to die, and then sell the land while the market was high. Wow. My family failed to do any of these things, so they didn't quite make, thank God, the fortunes that some people did, though they did make serious money.
When slavery was abolished, and I guess you mentioned that in 1833,
Yeah.
The slave didn't receive any compensation for the violence that been inflicted
Yeah.
upon them, and the only person who got any compensation were the slave owners. Can you tell us about that period?
It's absolutely terrible. It's a really interesting bit of the history. So right at the end, so it was suddenly realized that both by 1830, the people of Britain wanted to abolish slavery. It had become impossible. The rich people who owned plantations didn't, obviously, but it became obvious that you couldn't just say slavery's over, everyone's free, because the slave owners went, well, you're just taking our property away. That's actually, whatever your beliefs, you're actually stealing stuff that we invested in good faith. So you need to compensate us. And the thing is, because they dominated Parliament, you could never have got the act abolishing slavery through Parliament without a compensation bill. So this amazing sum of money, 20 million pounds in 1836, which is about 17 billion pounds today. And is it about £1 to £2 Canadian? I'm so sorry. I should know this.
Yeah.
It's say that 20 billion US, say,
Right.
Today, was given to some of the richest people, to the 17,000 slave owners, some of the richest people on the planet. And the slaves, as you say, it was thought enough that they got their freedom. So people like my ancestors, who were good people, they actually used some of the money to build churches and schools in Scotland, but nothing on the plantation where 200 people who had worked as slaves for them were now left with little employment and no land, and still not very many rights other than being technically free. So it was a really shabby end to a terrible, terrible story.
Wow.
And Britain kind of abandons the Caribbean sugar islands after that. We look on them for cheap labor and for people to come and fight in our wars, and they are British overseas citizens, like Canadians used to be, but they don't we don't invest anything in them. It's a bad story, Anna. I was brought up to think we were the best empire there'd ever been. I'm sure many people in Canada believe that too, but it's
wow. It sounds more like a horror movie than a story.
Yeah,
but let me ask you. So now Caribbean countries are calling for some compensation, and they are calling for from 10 different European nations. First of all, can you tell us which one of these nations which other nations were involved in the slave trade, and how is this panning out?
Right, there you just tested me there. So it's going to be France, Spain, Portugal, Germany, because of some of the pre-German states, Denmark, Sweden, Switzerland, because it supplied a lot of materials. I'm not doing very well.
Okay, well,
Britain, that's 8, Ireland 9. I'm getting there.
Okay, perfect. So what is there any? Is this pipe dreaming, or is there any real negotiation going on?
Yeah, so the Caribbean group of nations made this call very legitimately. Not just for money, but for talks about debt forgiveness and educational stuff and technology transfer back in 2014, and just asked for talks to begin. And in Denmark and France and a couple of other countries, talks are happening. Britain kind of just laughed at it and just said, get over yourselves, time to move on, while cutting overseas aid to the Caribbean countries at the same time. So we haven't reacted very well. And I think, the average British person goes, it's ancient history, because they were never taught about it. And Black people should stop complaining. That's when I talk about this thing, that's kind of what I get told as well, but in a less racist manner. But France is negotiating seriously with Haiti. Haiti's a kind of special case for reasons we won't have time to go into, but that'll happen. Denmark, I think, is actually on it and paying reparations, but Denmark had very little possessions in the Caribbean. But it's a start. And, and this is not just about money transfer, it's about friendship and peace and reconciliation, way overdue. But there are models. I mean, what Germany and Israel sorted out, for compensation and so on after the Second World War, only 100 years after slavery ended, that has been, I think a lot of people would say, a success in terms of national harmony.
Well, we're still living history. I mean, the racism in the United States, which is the one that I'm more familiarized with, is palpable, and you can feel it. You can see it from one neighborhood to the other. You can see it when a Black person applies for a job. But I have no idea of what is racism like in England.
Well, I see, there are more, the proportion of the prison population is much higher with Black people. Black people have less good jobs. I think, the key statistic, that's emerged in the last year is that Black people, and to an extent, people from Asian and other ethnic minorities, have died from COVID at 4 times the rate of white people. And there is no genetic or ethnic explanation for that. The explanation is poverty, poor education, and structural racism. I think America's racist problems are very florid. We have a inbuilt racism here, which can be quite terrifying. And there's an argument this very week about whether footballers should be bending the knee at football matches or not. I mean, it's still a very live issue, and it's still impairing people's lives in Britain today. And that's a racism that was invented by the British Empire in order to run the place. And I think that's something that my compatriots in Britain are going to have to wake up to and say sorry for, which we've never done.
I heard that in Jamaica, social class in a way is determined by the color of the
skin color.
Skin color. So
yeah,
we have many layers, many tones of skin colors, and I guess if you are darker, you are in a lower social class, and if you are lighter.
Yes, I mean, when I went to Jamaica and Tobago while I was researching this book, and I went to the sites, the places where my family had owned land and asked the people living there now. I asked everybody, academics as well, how slavery most impacted their lives today, and almost everyone said colorism. That issue where on the plantation, if you had a lighter skin, that meant you had some white blood, so you got a better job, and you were thought more intelligent and more like a white person. And it was so, and that still pertains. And that was, as a white person myself, that was a shock to me. I really did. But once my eyes were opened, I was going, yeah, you're right. And how come all the Coca-Cola adverts have really light-skinned Black people in them? What's that about? And I'm ashamed I didn't understand this, because it comes from what my ancestors did.
Well, it's for me, is looking at racism from a different point of view, from the British point of view. I wonder if you could tell us one more time the title of the book and where can followers go and find out more about it.
I'm looking to see if I've got a copy of it beside me. I haven't. It's called Blood Legacy, A Family's Reckoning with the Story of Slavery. It's available on Amazon and other sites, so it's physically in bookshops in Canada, I think on the 13th of September. But I have a website, bloodlegacybook.com, where I talk about the background to it, and also the efforts my family are making to try and, in a token way, pay some money back to charities in Jamaica and in the UK, to do the little we can. We can't possibly pay back. It's in the horror, the devastation, the murder is too great, but we can do small things.
Yes, I neglected.
And I should say the book's not for profit. I mean, any profits in the book are going to those causes.
I neglected to ask you this question. How are you dealing psychologically or emotionally with finding about your family history?
Well, thanks for asking. I mean, for me, I'm a journalist. You know, my instinct is for a good story. You know, and also I don't. You know, I think secrets. You know, we're happier if we shed light on secrets, and this is a big skeleton in my cupboard, in the nation's cupboard, and I think it's better that it's. So I feel, you know, the reception, particularly from people of African and Caribbean origin to this book, has been really, really positive. People say they're glad I've done it. So I'm feeling great. But I mean, there are members of my family who are quite angry about it. Mm. You know, it's an intrusion on their privacy. I don't see it was necessary. You know, and some of them aren't convinced that what we did was so very wrong. That attitude is still there among older people.
Well, Alex, thank you so much for your time.
Hey, thank you.